The golden lights of the Willard Intercontinental Hotel glowed like a palace of power and privilege in the heart of Washington, D.C. That evening, the city's elite, politicians, investors, media stars, glided across the crimson carpet in flowing gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was filled with subtle laughter and quiet conversations, the kind that masked calculated ambitions. It was a scene of high society at its most polished. But amid the glitter and prestige, Jasmine Crockett walked in, and everything changed. As the White House press secretary, Jasmine had attended countless events. But tonight, as the only black woman in the room, she felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Her elegant dark gown didn't shield her from the scrutiny. Her role in the Trump administration didn't protect her from the whispers. Each step she took echoed louder than it should have. Each glance that lingered a second too long wasn't curiosity, it was judgment. She passed polished marble columns and grand chandeliers, but all she could feel was isolation. A group of guests whispered behind their wine glasses, questioning why she was even there. One voice cut sharper than the others. "She's just a political token." Jasmine heard it. She felt it. Though she held her head high, a storm stirred inside her. This wasn't just a night of diplomacy. It was a silent battlefield, and Jasmine Crockett, though surrounded by power, stood alone, undervalued, underestimated. She didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, she would be forced into the spotlight. Not as a press secretary, not as a politician, but as a woman ready to fight for her dignity. Not with words, but with music. The crowd was about to witness something unforgettable, and it all began with silence and the weight of invisible prejudice. Just as the tension in the grand ballroom began to settle, the double doors swung open again, and the very air seemed to shift. In walked Ethan Caldwell, a man whose reputation preceded him, not just as a world-renowned pianist, but as a provocateur known for using his art as a political weapon. Tall, sharply dressed, and exuding arrogance with every step, Ethan walked like a man who believed the room belonged to him. The chandeliers above caught the sheen of his tailored tuxedo, casting a glow on his slicked-back hair and confident smirk. All conversation paused. Every head turned. The soft hum of music, clinking glasses, and muted laughter faded into silence. It wasn't just his fame, it was the challenge he carried in his presence. Ethan's eyes scanned the room until they landed squarely on Jasmine Crockett. Without a word, he strolled to the grand piano near the center of the hall. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he placed his hand on the piano lid and turned toward the crowd. His gaze cut through the room like a blade, and then, with calculated precision, it fell back on Jasmine. "Well," he said, his voice laced with condescension, "I suppose a political gathering could use a bit of real talent tonight." The remark wasn't aimed at anyone else. It was aimed directly at her. He sat down, played a few lazy notes, then looked back at Jasmine again. "Tell me, Madam Press Secretary," he added with a smirk, "do you play, or are your talents limited to reading from a teleprompter?" The crowd chuckled, softly, but loud enough for the insult to land. Cameras turned toward Jasmine. Journalists subtly raised their phones. It was no longer about music. It was about humiliation. Ethan wasn't here to entertain. He was here to dominate, and Jasmine was his target. But what he didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was that the woman he had just mocked wasn't just a political figure. Beneath the surface, beneath the polished professionalism, Jasmine Crockett carried a secret that would soon leave the room speechless. And Ethan? He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The moment Ethan's smug challenge echoed through the hall, the room turned into a stage, and Jasmine was now the unwilling lead. Her heart pounded beneath her silk dress, though she stood perfectly still. The chandeliers above still glimmered like constellations, but they no longer felt warm. The room had transformed into a cold arena, and every eye in it was a weapon aimed at her pride. Whispers buzzed like mosquitoes around her. Does she even play? She's probably never touched a piano. This is about to be embarrassing. Their words cut deep, not because she feared failure, but because she had already heard them in different forms her whole life. The same tone, different rooms. Jasmine tried to breathe deeply, but the air felt heavier with every second. Cameras began to click. The journalists who once interviewed her now turned into voyeurs, waiting to capture a spectacle. The moment the press secretary cracked, she remembered every battle she had faced on camera. Tough interviews, political attacks. But this was different. This was personal. This wasn't about politics. It was about her worth. Her very existence was being questioned, and she could see it in their eyes. They didn't just want her to fail. They expected it. Ethan tapped a playful arpeggio on the piano, then looked over his shoulder with a crooked grin. "Come now, Madam Secretary. Surely someone from your background knows how to keep up." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Her blood boiled. She clenched her fists. Every instinct told her to walk away, to retreat and survive another day. But something deeper, older, stirred inside her. A fire that had once been quiet for years flickered to life. It whispered, "Don't run." Jasmine met Ethan's gaze. Calm, controlled. Then, without a word, she turned toward the grand piano. The room gasped, not in volume, but in breathlessness. She didn't stop. Her heels echoed softly on the marble floor as she walked. And Ethan's smirk began to fade. As Jasmine approached the piano, her fingers trembled, not with fear, but recognition. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Not since her childhood, when her dreams were composed in melodies, not policies. She remembered the little Baptist church where her fingers first learned to dance over ivory keys. She was a child then, no politics, no expectations, just music and light pouring in through stained glass windows. She had once dreamed of Juilliard, of recitals and compositions. But that was before her world convinced her dreams were too fragile for someone like her. "Art doesn't feed you," her mother once said. "Be strong. Be something they can't ignore." So Jasmine buried that part herself. She chose politics, where power spoke louder than art. She had survived brutal media storms, defended presidents, and become one of the most recognized black women in American politics. But in doing so, she had left her music behind, locked it in a room she never opened until tonight. As she sat before the grand piano, the crowd buzzed with mockery. Ethan crossed his arms, amused. But Jasmine didn't care anymore. She let her fingers hover over the keys like they were old friends. The lights faded from her mind. So did the crowd. And then she played the first note. It was soft, almost tentative, but it rang with clarity. She didn't play a simple hymn. She chose something powerful, Rhapsody in Blue, a piece as bold and American as she was. The melody began to build, her confidence growing with every chord. She wasn't just playing a song. She was resurrecting the self she had buried to survive. And somewhere between the first movement and the crescendo, Jasmine remembered who she really was. As Jasmine's fingers danced across the keys, the sound of Rhapsody in Blue swelled and pulsed through the air like a rising tide. The crowd, once brimming with smug laughter and whispered derision, suddenly grew quiet, uncomfortably quiet. It wasn't just because the music was beautiful. It was because they hadn't expected it to come from her. Ethan Caldwell, who had taken such pleasure in belittling her, remained frozen beside the piano. The man who had tried to use his virtuosity as a weapon now found himself outplayed, not by skill alone, but by something far more devastating, emotion. Each note Jasmine played was a rebellion, a statement, a memory. The deep rumble of the bass echoed the frustration she had buried for years. The trills and flourishes carried the pain of being underestimated. The soaring melody wasn't just Gershwin. It was Jasmine, reclaiming her place in a room that had tried to erase her. As the tempo quickened, so did her heartbeat. The adrenaline no longer clouded her. It fueled her. Her hands moved with precision, not perfection, but with something far rarer, truth. The audience, once skeptical, was now captivated. They leaned forward unconsciously, drawn to something they couldn't explain. She was playing not to impress, not to win, but to free herself. The harsh judgments, the smirks, the whispers, they melted with every bar of music. The sound lifted the weight from her shoulders, and in its place, a strength she had long forgotten took root. She didn't need their approval. She didn't even need their applause. All she needed was this moment. Ethan, once lounging confidently, now stood awkwardly. He glanced toward the audience, searching for someone to mock alongside, but no one met his eye. They were all focused on Jasmine, on the storm she had conjured from the keys. The final movement approached, a whirlwind of syncopated rhythm and unrelenting energy. Her fingers blurred. The music surged like a wave about to crash over the walls of prejudice that had enclosed her. And then, silence. The final chord lingered in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't bow. She sat still, her fingers resting gently on the keys, her breathing steady but full of fire. The audience didn't erupt immediately. They were too stunned. But then, like thunder rolling over a plain, the applause began. First a few, then many, then all. It wasn't polite. It wasn't political. It was raw. It was real. And it was hers. For the first time that night, Jasmine Crockett smiled. Not because she had won, but because she had finally returned to herself. And the man who had mocked her? He now stood in the wreckage of his own arrogance, silenced not by rebuttal, but by music. As the final echoes of the piano faded, a deep, weighty silence blanketed the room. For a moment, no one moved. No glass clinked. No phone clicked. No breath was drawn too loudly. It was as if time itself had paused to honor what had just happened. The grand chandelier still sparkled above, casting its golden glow on hundreds of stunned faces. But none of them looked the same as they had 10 minutes earlier. Where once there had been smirks and suspicion, now there were parted lips, softened eyes, and expressions stripped of arrogance. Jasmine Crockett remained at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the ivory keys. She didn't flinch. She didn't seek validation. The applause had long erupted and passed, but she hadn't stood yet. She was grounded, not in victory, but in clarity. She had come into this hall as a symbol, a target, an outsider. But now, she was undeniably human, unquestionably brilliant, irrefutably equal. Ethan Caldwell stood just feet away, but his presence had all but vanished from the crowd's consciousness. The once glorified virtuoso, now stiff and visibly shaken, had no clever retort. His eyes, once sharp with mockery, were now lowered, his face pale. The confidence he had worn like a cape was nowhere to be found. Someone in the back whispered, "She didn't just play, she told a story." Another murmured, "I misjudged her." One by one, the audience began to rise. Not out of social pressure, not because they felt obligated, but because they could not stand. The sound of chairs scraping across marble echoed like a slow, thunderous awakening. And then it came, the second wave of applause. Louder, stronger, unanimous. People clapped, not only for the music, but for what it meant. A senator who had dismissed Jasmine hours earlier now clapped with both hands, his mouth open in disbelief. A journalist who had once called her a puppet of the press room now recorded silently, eyes moist. No one looked at Jasmine the same, because she wasn't the same. In one performance, she had undone years of quiet dismissal, of shallow assumptions. She hadn't debated. She hadn't lectured. She had spoken in a universal language, and they had heard her. Still seated, Jasmine finally lifted her hands from the keys. She looked up, eyes meeting the crowd. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The fire in her gaze said everything. She had shown them not just who she was, but who they weren't. And in the heart of that once hostile room, silence had done what no argument ever could. It had made them listen. Ethan Caldwell stood frozen, as if rooted to the polished floor beneath his Italian leather shoes. The smirk that had curled at the edges of his mouth all evening had long since melted into a look of bewildered disbelief. His carefully constructed image, virtuoso, provocateur, untouchable, had cracked. And in the fragments of that shattered ego, truth stared back at him. He had expected a collapse. Instead, Jasmine had risen. What he thought would be a performance-ending taunt had become her awakening. She had not only accepted his challenge, she had transcended it. With every key she struck, she dismantled the walls he thought would trap her. And now, he stood in the ruins of his own superiority, applause ringing not for him, but for the woman he tried to belittle. The crowd barely looked his way anymore. Where once they had circled him like satellites around a star, now their gravity pulled toward Jasmine. Ethan's name, moments ago whispered with reverence, was now a cautionary footnote in a moment of transformation. He tried to speak. He parted his lips slightly, as if to explain, to deflect, to reclaim. But no words came. What could he possibly say? That he misjudged her? That he had confused her calm for weakness, her skin for limitation, her background for inferiority? No apology would have sufficed. No explanation would matter. And so, he did nothing. And in doing nothing, he said everything. He stepped back from the piano, each motion stiff, as though his body resisted the movement his mind demanded. His eyes never met Jasmine's again. He turned slightly, as if to disappear into the crowd, but the crowd wasn't watching him anymore. They were still watching her, still processing what they had just witnessed, still unlearning their assumptions in real time. A nearby reporter leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "That wasn't just a performance. That was a reckoning." Ethan heard it. He heard everything now. The applause, the quiet murmurs of awakening, the silence between claps that used to belong to him. And Jasmine, she didn't glance in his direction. She didn't gloat. She didn't acknowledge his defeat, not out of cruelty, but because she no longer needed anything from him. His relevance had expired the moment her first chord rang out. He had brought her here to expose her weakness. Instead, she revealed his. His silence, once a tool of intimidation, had become the loudest confession in the room. Not because he couldn't speak, but because nothing he said could undo what had been done. In the end, Jasmine never had to defeat Ethan Caldwell with words. She had already left him behind, a man silenced by truth and erased by music. At first, it was only one person. A woman in a silver gown near the back slowly rose to her feet, hands clapping gently but deliberately, as if unsure if she had permission, but certain that she had to. Then another guest followed, then another, and suddenly the entire room stood, wave after wave of applause rolling through the grand ballroom like thunder after lightning. The same people who had whispered, doubted, mocked, were now standing tall, eyes wide, chins lifted. Their applause wasn't hollow or obligatory. It was genuine, a rare moment in Washington, D.C., where pretense gave way to raw, undeniable respect. Jasmine Crockett had not only played the piano, she had played the truth. And everyone in that room, whether they liked it or not, had heard it. The senator who hours ago had scoffed at her presence now clapped so hard his cufflinks shimmered in the chandelier light. A media executive who had earlier muttered, "She's a token," now stood with her hand over her heart, tears pricking her eyes. The room had not just turned. They had been turned, not by policy, not by debate, but by the kind of art that reveals the soul beneath the skin. Cameras clicked, but they didn't feel invasive now. They felt reverent, as if each frame was an attempt to capture history in motion. A reporter whispered to her assistant, "We came for politics, but we're leaving with a sermon." Ethan Caldwell stood motionless to the side, watching the tide he once controlled sweep past him. He was no longer the center, no longer the story. Jasmine had taken that center not by force, not by speech, but by being exactly who she was. Still seated at the piano, Jasmine took a breath. Her hands rested gently on her lap, her shoulders relaxed, but her eyes held a kind of stillness that only came after a storm had been survived. She didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't gesture for more. She didn't need to. She had nothing left to prove. She had already rewritten the room. The ovation continued, a slow, roaring release of everything the crowd had held inside. Prejudice, doubt, discomfort, and replaced with something purer, admiration. People didn't just clap because she played well. They clapped because she reminded them what it meant to be human, to fight without hate, to rise without arrogance, to overcome without vengeance. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett was no longer the black press secretary or the controversial political figure. She was something far rarer in Washington. She was respected. And for once, the power in the room didn't come from office, party, or title. It came from truth, and Jasmine had played it, note for note. By the time Jasmine Crockett left the ballroom, the moment was no longer confined to the Willard Hotel. It had gone viral. Clips of her performance spread like wildfire across social media. The hashtags appeared within minutes. Hashtag Jasmine plays truth. Hashtag music over mockery. Hashtag she played them all. Twitter, X exploded. Instagram Reels looped the last few moments of her piano solo with captions like, "This wasn't a song. This was a revolution in a gown." TikTok teens, political commentators, and even classical music influencers were all sharing the same video. Jasmine, her fingers flying across the keys, surrounded by silence, followed by thunderous applause. In less than an hour, the performance had tens of millions of views. Celebrities chimed in. A famous pianist tweeted, "This woman reminded us what music is really for. Power without violence. Emotion without ego." Even critics who had previously dismissed her role in the administration were forced to acknowledge the undeniable artistry and strength she had shown. But the impact wasn't just digital, it was personal. Thousands of young black girls commented things like, "I want to be like her. She made me feel proud." They looked at her like nothing, and she gave them everything. And quietly, in homes across America, people began to re-examine how easily they'd pass judgment based on skin, title, or silence. Because Jasmine hadn't just played the piano. She had played their hearts. And in doing so, she'd reminded the world that some of the loudest victories are made in silence. That night, Jasmine returned home, not to cameras or podiums, but to the quiet warmth of her small apartment. The world outside was still spinning in hashtags and headlines, but here, it was just family, just love. Her husband, Nicholas, met her at the door. He said nothing at first, just wrapped her in his arms, holding her tightly, like he'd known all along she'd survive the storm. Whispering in her ear, "You didn't win because you fought. You won because you didn't run." Their infant son slept peacefully in his crib nearby, untouched by the weight of the world his mother had just carried and laid down. Jasmine watched him breathe, then turned her gaze to the corner of the room. The old upright piano sat waiting. She crossed the room, still in her gown, and lowered herself onto the bench. No lights, no audience, no one to impress. Just her. Her fingers floated above the keys, then gently, softly began to play. This time, it wasn't a challenge. It was a return to the girl who once believed music was a place where she could be herself. To the part of her she had buried beneath politics, performance, and pressure. She played for no one. And for the first time in years, that was enough. As the final note lingered, Jasmine closed her eyes. She had reclaimed not just her voice, but her peace.